a delicate piece of paper that if you store it that way, then the edges are gonna, it's like not good for the art. It should be flat, like in a flat file.
I think this is, and I wonder, and someone who is a photographer, and you could answer this, but I think you're pointing to starting to, like, that your response is that you already have, like, ideas about the value system of an archive. An archive is supposed to keep things safe, but in fact, the tag reading is not at all about preservation. Which is one of my also jump tos about the archive. The archive is to preserve, to keep safe, right? Like, oh my gosh, what is that, a grease stain? Oh no, like, we have to get different types of tissue. As if, like, that's the, like, the
single purpose.
And the tag, I think, what's really interesting to me, or to think about the file cabinet, is it's not necessarily about the keeping of the things safe. It's about the organization of those things.
Or it's as much about the organization as it is about keeping.
Or
Because if
also-
a straight definition of archive is, the first thing is that it's about segregating a collection for posterity, right?
Or for, in the
Or
case
for scholarship.
or for display,
Or, yes.
right? Like that there's something of like, look how fancy that I am, all the things that I have
Right.
in my house for you to look at. Before we were, or not before, since certainly there were archives of things that are for posterity before. You know, like I'm sure the Romans were doing that. I don't know how, but this seems like this other kind of like personal. It's also, it's like it takes place in the domestic space.
A bit. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
A bit in the domestic space, and then when it doesn't, it's like very directly unsafe, you know, and it's got this real like reign of terror feel to it. And I think like calling on Deleuze and Guattari's like idea of capture, you know, was pretty striking to me. Like talking about sort of the violence of the archive and then the violence of reclaiming the archive, and then how the scale is always like both too big and too small for the object.
Right.
That was like far away from the domestic. And then the domestic started really wonderfully because it's like, well, here's this invention that for the first time like allows for this kind of home life archive, you know. Finally people can sort of like begin to collect themselves. But then that too got weird when he's talking about how, like, if everybody continues making images on 28, the camera has become a production machine, and then spewing forth a stream of commodities and such a promise of profusion that we're in danger of being entirely submerged if other cameras follow suit and the stream becomes a deluge. So it's like this idea of, like, even in the domestic, there's this, like, sort of small amount of terror where personal image making can still sort of, like, begin to accrue this thing that, like, no one can really control, and suddenly we have this, like, deluge of, like, cameras taking pictures as, like, a stream, you know, as something that, like, we can't contain. And I thought like fear was a really interesting thing that I got from
on that,
reading this.
that was the most interesting part for me, was his takedown of the fear that people have about the surveillance state.
Yeah.
Which is like, they're like, what he seemed to point to, which I don't know how, I haven't really figured out whether I agree with it or not, it was like, there's always going to be too much information for the state to really handle. And so no matter, so if their goal is to capture all the information available about us, then really the terror that they're creating for themselves is far greater than what they're able to subdue, you know what I'm saying? Like, that to me was like totally mind-blowing. It was like, people who think that the government is going to like control all possible information don't really understand how the archive works. And I thought that was like really very exciting and interesting. Did I get that part right? Did you guys read the same thing that I
Well,
got?
when you're saying, I like the example, the like small early example of the like the archive of criminals,
Yeah.
And like very quickly it became apparent that like it would take more people and more man hours than is even possible to try and compare any one given criminal with this set of images that was becoming so huge.
Well, because the inherent variables are infinite. Everything
Right.
leads to every other thing.
And I mean, I think the fear, at least, and then, so I like watched Citizen Citizen 4 like last semester, but like that to me the terror seems more located in the categorization, not in the accumulation of the information. Meaning that like what's frightening is if you have a bunch of images of criminals, how you start to like are they divided by skin color right away? Of course. How do we start to like clump and thus like negate nuance, or that there's that part of the fear is not just all of them and that it's so unwieldy, but the fear of the like citizen is like I'll be put into a category that doesn't accurately reflect. That was my thinking.
Yeah, it definitely reinforces certain types of like systematic oppressions and like what you're saying about are people automatically divided by skin color? Like, how do we start to like divide things up, especially when it's talking about the state? Like, I definitely think that's relevant. And also, like, even though the government can't keep track of like photos of everyone and all this stuff, like it's true on the other hand that like people don't have access to like the thousands and thousands of laws and regulations that like you can actually get in trouble for. Like most people don't really know how many laws there are. I was reading this really interesting article about this a couple weeks ago about like why I'm not doing anything wrong is like the wrong way to think about surveillance culture, because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of laws and cases that like, you know, there are so many things that are illegal like that seem so like dumb, but like you really, if like someone in the government decided they wanted to like target you, they could. So it's kind of like it's on both ends that like there's this like I don't know, very like lockout of information on both ends of the archive.
I guess what I was pointing to, what I was trying to like say was that not that there's nothing to fear from the government. I mean, we all know that's kind of that there is a lot to fear, but that the problem with the archive and archive thinking is that you'll always be behind. There's always going to be more data, more documentation, more stuff that you need to index, and that you need to categorize, you need to classify, there's always going to be more. And the terror is of being in this deluge, right? Deluge, right? Of like just being flooded with information and having to spend inordinate amounts of money, time, effort, people's time and lives like on sorting. You know what I mean? And that's what ultimately ends up happening, that we're all like, I have a camera and I take a lot of photographs, and Jesus Christ, if I knew how much time I spent organizing the photos. And now I have systems, but like, all of us with phones and things know what that is. Imagine on like a state level what kind of information garbage they have to deal with.
This is just me thinking about the reading on the count that question, that open question, whether it be a terror, fear, or just the word that I'm not thinking of, is that somehow energizing me to keep me to making more and better archives, or to redefine my own archiving systems, or to question that took away from
I feel like it was still hard for me to.
being private, taking care of yourself and taking care of others. So
There's like interior exterior, which takes us right to the idea of like
there's like a political
thinking dualities, or the relationship of the container to the
How do
contained,
you
that
then
actually
like
it's like
use that?
gets like
how to use it.
right.
It's like an imperative.
Sort of like
Touch.
archive entry
Yeah, but I mean, you know, we can go both ways.
and like and response, meaning that Julian could submit something and you could be interested in it and create like either add to that archive and or respond to that archive. Right, do you know what I mean? Like it's like if you take the lace for example, how we're like, I don't know how this got in here. Like that there could be like like we could devise a structure that asked us to insert or respond. It's similar to like this, but then it would be archive entry plus response, you know, archive entry plus response. Or it could be like, going back to here, it could be like entries, responses.
The structure is the immediate
Or
environment.
real archive, fake archive, whatever it was like,
You know, no matter how loving it is, it's still.
Yeah, I guess I'm like interested in using like the kind of appeal of like taking on authority, like treating it like we're scientists or we're like in charge somehow, and dealing with like these sort of very personal things in a way that like seems very clinical, you know?
But it's interesting
That
because,
to
like,
me
you think about
is like super appealing.
Sort of like you're bringing in something really personal, but allowing it to like become a part of like a bigger thing. Like it's not about it like standing alone anymore. It's like I'm gonna put this out and like hope that like someone else can like add something or like change it or just like change the context and not just being seen like that.
and that might connect back to your comment, like, idea of the structure, like that being an invitation or an ongoing archive, meaning that we were modeling it, but that it was, the goal of it was to continue somehow, like.
That would be like a main, the structure teaches all of your possibilities.
Maybe I'm jumping ahead.
Choose your adventure.
Yeah.
Don't worry about
Archive, that's awesome.
Don't worry about how it would happen,
Well-
exactly. Only worry about if your ideas might rearrange or ask for a rearranging of the structure.
Okay.
I mean,
Not have
one
it
of the
be
things I think about.
an archive entry at all. It could be
Simplify, like in order to, it's going from big to small or
entry
small to big.
plus
You know,
response
like that would be one.
or whatever, meaning like that we would just literally, could just literally bring in some things that were important to us.
That.
Like that we hadn't already been thinking about as actually being a collection of things.
And like find a way to
I think
organize that.
if we
Yeah.
if we were to do some like
The
meetings,
development of a structure for archiving, not an actual archive.
The two main things.
I think because it kind of
all the
releases you
different,
from the object.
um,
Because like, I maybe it's just me. It's like I'm super
far
object based,
and-
but like my mind immediately went to like, okay, what can I bring in?
for
Like
lots
what we've done, and relevant to the project.
Well, and I think it like definitely touches on
are you guys doing
my interest in like acting with authority.
Yeah.
Because
So
I
you
feel like
said
as we get caught up in like what's a
versus-
collection, what's a library, what's an archive, like sometimes the nod is just
So I'm
gonna be
thinking, what
for
if you did
like
like,
declaring
we did it like that.
something.
Intimate
So I think like it's interesting to
Extimate?
work on
intimate, what's like what's an
an
extreme?
authority that allows us to like do something larger.
Something,
impersonal.
yeah,
Yeah.
because then we can put another piece of paper over the top and create.
Gorgeous book that is just like photographs that are arranged like progressively in terms of like visual composition and how they relate to each other. So.
So what do we mean by
So it would just be like okay, like a wheel on the next page is like a manhole cover. Next page is like
But can we put it
something
into
that looks to that. So that
different
you,
kinds of-
it's like this, the start and the beginning are completely different, but like everything in between it totally connects them and flows from like
You
one
know, like
point
a
start. Let's starting point to like one
family
ending.
versus government.
Whatever is being like added to it, or how we're changing in our perceptions of like what we're doing.
That is. And then we start pulling things together.
Like start with the sticker book and end up with like the water crisis. Okay.
Our subject matter is fluid in the same way that you're talking about, you know, because it's not like we're going to have like, oh, circle, square, triangle, and then it's like, I mean, we could have that. Or compositional, you know.
described to myself. I have to describe them to myself.
And when you're talking about this, I almost imagine things
And
that
in the
someone
process
could,
of
you,
describing and
the aim is to look at them as a sequence, but they haven't necessarily been sequenced by one person, meaning it's a little bit of the, like, what's the thing where you draw on someone else draws? Right, where someone could, like, for example, insert something in between two things and start to change it or whatever.
Or not touching each other.
And this, to me, your comment feels about related to that, but like from the subject matter.
That's what I'm.
It's not about like formal connections, it's about like,
But I hear what you're saying and what you're saying too, because
then we could define the kind of connections.
also.
You know, like, they could be psychological, they could be
Ideological.
emotional, they could be ideological, they could be practical. Like, right? There could be like
This seems so funny to me.
spectrum of like movement from okay, we're like each doing our own thing in our own little world, archiving, we're bringing them in and getting them to live together. Okay, functions with those. Okay, no, we're going to start to create prompts for the archive itself by like putting something in and then asking someone else to put something else in response to it. And this actually feels like it sits us outside. I think that this is like a sort of meta one.
Yeah.
I actually think that this is a different idea.
Yeah.
Like this is an idea, and then all of these are kind of iterations on another idea. And then we have these like sort of refinements of refinements of that idea, which is like, okay, like these things can be like a sort of formal, exquisite corpse, or we can start with something outlandish and begin to like supply and like define different types of responses to it. Putting things in the archive and categorizing them simultaneously, and that it's something that would be open. And then this is like, we're not creating an archive. This is like the more solid version. We're creating instructions for the making of an archive.
Build archives and making an archive that sort of had other nested archives in it. We were thinking a lot about the personal and interior and exterior. And so we came up with, and y'all should chime in at any point, these kind of 3 different paths we could imagine going on. One is an archive of archives. I don't know if I can really speak to that one very well.
So it would be kind of a way of getting around the completely group project setup we have here, I think. So like a person would like bring in an archive and like we would make an archive of that archive, like treating the personal archive as like a single object and then like putting them together in some kind of organizational way. And then the archive of archives, the B option would be a little more structured, following a theme. So like we'd ask people to tailor their archives to a theme.
So are like examples where, in the first one, each person would be sort of tasked with creating an archive that would be submitted to this larger archive. Those, in some ways, the least collaborative, the most hands-off. And then the second one would be to decide on a theme. We identified like interior, exterior. So like each person would be invited to develop an archive of interior images, artifacts, whatever it might be, and then the archive would be, instead of being organized by person, would be in fact organized by theme. So it would be like, here's interior nested in these individuals, here's exterior nested into these individuals, right? So just 2 different ways of imagining an archive of archives.
So is that step, I'm just now, are these 3 different ideas? So it's not one idea, 3.
So then our second idea was the archive as prompt. Or that's what we decided we would call it, to try and explain it.
That's something I think I in my group, like really in our group really quickly kind of we talked about. I called it archive of archives, but I think I meant like archive as prompt, like looking or finding archives in, or actually you guys explain it and then I'll see if that's like where my head was also.
So we were sort of talking about it being like a little bit more active instead of static. And I think an example that we used that was really very like kind of minutia was we were talking about this book that Elise has of old stickers from middle school, like a sticker book. And that would be sort of like archive A along this one path. And then someone could like sort of submit this archive of, say, like cat stickers in archive A. And so we were talking about like, right, like using the sort of call of one archive to respond with these sort of sub-archives.
We would be charging ourselves to bring something to the archive and then charging each other to respond with a new archive that was created in relationship to that.
So one person would bring in
Or
one
we would-
thing or
We
all?
would maybe all, but we haven't worked out the details of how that.
But you said an example of a sticker book, so that's one person bringing in and then all responding.
There could be that, or
Could be a
could
chain effect.
be a chain effect, or
Like
someone responds to the next one.
Oh,
Yeah, okay.
And then the B one, we called outlandish hyperlinking. And we were sort of talking about starting with one outlandish archive, say even the same like sticker book, and then kind of developing from that these like psychological connections or ideological connections or emotional connections, and sort of getting to maybe like a less outlandish conclusion. You know, so you start with the sticker book and you're archiving and you end up with X.
Like a very
Start off as like an outlandish abstract idea, even as like the beginning, as like the prompt for the archive, and then we're like bringing stuff in to respond to it.
yeah, like like with the end goal being like to reach this concrete, like more solidified kind of
is the concrete and solidified predetermined?
it could be.
I don't think we were thinking of it. I think we were imagining when we were talking about it, like some kind of agreed upon exaggeration, be it a statement, an image, like text, and then the development of the archive would be sort of, we would be bringing things in relationship to it and categorizing them simultaneously. To sort of cloud out, like creating a hyperlink trail, so to speak. So it wouldn't actually become concrete in the end. It would be like a really hazy, fuzzy exploration of connections surrounding this.
Well, yeah, I guess, or concrete in the beginning. Like there's some maybe concrete point where it could be your start or it could be your end, which is how I was looking at it. Like,
But the concrete end could be something like illuminates makes a portrait of a society or captures culture at this moment. Like that could be
Yeah.
the concrete end that the outlandish,
Totally.
you know.
Through like this kind of exhaustive.
yeah.
But I mean, I think the idea of just getting to an end, well, it's the hyperlinking we do all the time. You know, I would have to hear more about why that would be different than what I'm gonna do when I go upstairs and start searching, JSTOR or whatever.
Yeah, I think a predetermined end sort of goes with our like third idea, which was development of structure for archiving. And the first one's model. And so like we would create the model, and the model could be deciding that a predetermined end is like creating a portrait of society. And we don't know who would actually decide that model would be. It's just about creating a model and then using that model both as like a guide for archiving and for us to actually archive for this actual project.
Why does it say workshop?
That's the second one. That we could either develop the structure as just like a model or as something that could like become a workshop.
So like we wouldn't be making an archive, we would be
Creating the rules for making
an
an archive.
invitation to archive, prompts for archiving, imagining structures so that people might archive in them.
Or we could start the archive and leave it open at the end of this semester. It's something we, well, like I asked about, I was like, are we closing this? And that's something we can all like talk about.
We felt like in number 2 and number 3 as like structures, there's the potential for them to be open, like that you can imagine people contributing to them afterwards.
And we could still even create the archive with the third one, because we could create the instructions and then be the first to follow it and be the example for others to follow.
Yeah, I wrote generate for the archive as we are archiving down. It's kind of like, yeah, we could do it like side by side. I feel like number 3 could like go along with any other project we're doing kind of.
Yeah, it's like a method of instruction, a method of construction.
The,
We threw around the term design thinking.
I was throwing around Fred Wilson and some of the artists that I've known that have played with the idea of using it in the walls of the structure and created models at museums and like kind of left it participatory on the part of that. That's what I was thinking about when we were talking. So should we present ours and then talk around? I think there's some overlap. Who wants Justina, Tal, and Jamie? Not Justina, why don't you do it? Where's the part of the video? You have the task? You don't have to.
Sorry, I'm fading.
Oh, don't fade. Now's not a good time to fade.
I know.
I put a little thingy there, based on what I thought was the consensus of our conversation. More like what they think so is on the bottom left.
How could you do it?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Sophia?
I mean, I'll like start it and we can all just.
We're a very polite group.
Well, we started with like what is loss, and then that was like the first thing, and then it kind of like turned into loss of touch and how like everything's becoming like not so tactile, and then how to document the touch that we're losing, sort of, right? Pretty much. And then we kind of like kept trying to come up with a structure, which kind of sort of like ended up like most of the stuff ended up more in the gray area than it did in the structure that we made. So we just went with input output, and I think, well, like input output was an easy one because there's always like in any type of touch there's always like the toucher and the thing being touched, and there's like an energy and like a cool relationship there. So.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting subject because it's very physical, but it's also very emotional, especially when you bring in issues of consent and aggression and intimacy and like public-private issues, and so there's a lot there. And also, it has this potential to be both like, I guess like theory-minded and cold, and also like very warm and intimate and nostalgic and sentimental. There's some like interesting play that we can have, and almost everything is in a gray area. Like the input-output framework could be interesting as categories, but they mean ultimately very little, and because of that, and because touch is so readily accessible to us, but for social norms and technological norms and whatever, like, we feel it to be inaccessible. It's an archive of things lost that are readily available. There's something like,
It answers the
It's-
question, what do you want to document now? Which is the loss of touch, meaning a bigger loss of touch. And we talked about, how Barbara reading that with every technological advance, that there's a kind of poverty that's created, and to what it's important to look at what's lost in all of what we would look at now as technological gains, but there are so many losses that happen, namely touch. You know, it was kind of, that was what we, the structure was super hard, which is interesting because there's lots of structures here that you guys did, but we were not, we did pay attention to the fact that it looked like we had 2 columns and a bridge. And that already was starting to be a structure, you know, that the gray area was dense and the 2 edges were kind of wide open.
Are the 2 edges like input and output?
Well, we didn't start like that, but that's where,
like how we ended.
that's kind of how we ended. It was a way to look at it. And we were just, when we ended, we were just tossing about, it doesn't matter. It was more just breaking it open more. The structure was not immediately apparent to us, right? But the subject seemed to be,
Well, it
Like
seems to me to be like an example of a subject, like for the structure 1B.
I thought you were gonna say 2A.
Please refer to 1B. But like that. We're talking about interior, exterior, input, output, right? That, like somehow then these things would be organized by theme, and we would be supplying or generating things individually towards that end, and then complicated even more between like a gray area between these, or like the front and the back, or the left and the right, or whatever.
That also ties so directly into to structure 3, because I think that, you know, that goes with model. So within model you have a theme, and we didn't really create themes, but you did. So, or subject. So, like, what about the combination of those 2? Like, I think that that's something really enticing.
I thought it went more with 2A, call response, because to me, the call was what's important to document now, which I translated in my head to what do I need to save, and what would be fun to document. It went down into those 2 things. And so I was like, I knew what was important to save because I think about that. But I also, you know, the call and response is speaking to the fun part of things to me.
So one of the things that we were talking about, that I've started to think about just generally, is like, and I mentioned it when we were talking as a group, is that we're not going to be able to do something necessarily comprehensive in, 14 weeks. So, and we're not going to be able to become experts in something in that period of time. So then, and the reason I mention this is because on the subject of like what is lost or things that we've lost touch for, most of us in the room haven't spent a lot of time living in a world like digital interface. So like how would we focus on things that would have been lost if we don't even personally all know what those would be? Do you know what I mean? Like there's something about like where I'm hesitant to place our subject matter in a time that precedes us as opposed to a time that we're engaged in, because we want to be generating things that we relate to in response to the idea of touch. Like I'm so much more interested in touch, not as a loss, but just as a like how touch works now, but then also of course we'll run into things about touch that were lost. You know what I mean?
It immediately it was immediately switched over to touch. Like that was implied.
Also,
But
there's like in terms of categories, which I think is an interest. I mean, because it's a perceptual thing, touch, and already we have perception just for hot, cold, wet, dry, rough, and smooth. I think that's it, right? That's a comprehensive thing. And those can also be metaphors that are like kind of, we can take that out.
They can
and
be
put it out,
buckets.
but, like, there's already like an implied biological category.
But I mean, like, if you think about the form of the archive and the relationship of number of buckets to things in the buckets, or it's just something I think that we should think about formally. Like, for example, we can have buckets with nothing in them. It's perfectly fine. Archive buckets that haven't been filled.
But
Meaning
it's for
we
the
can-
future.
Right. Or we can imagine our archive is, it's like the same, I'm like thinking about it as a book. Like at a certain point in time before you start your book, you have to ask yourself, is it thick or is it thin? Is it big or is it small?
Yeah.
And like,
The
what,
big.
what can I do, right? Like, so like, how thick can it be, our archive, or how thick do we want it to be? If it's only like kind of thick, do we want it to not have to be attempted to be thick? I don't know, I was just thinking about that.
The broad subject area of touch is, and we talked about things that were ready-made archives, things that just arrived to us with a category, already categorized. We talked about like a 1 square foot of the forest, and we didn't, Tal, you just pulled that out of your head. That was so like. In some ways, touch already comes with its own criteria. I know there's many other things, but that seems to me that formally a structure that can work for us. That if there already is some kind of criteria for us to bounce off against,
Okay, so in our last 15 minutes, I feel like we need to discuss, and I don't necessarily, because I don't know what to assign, but I think we should discuss maybe what you guys think you should be doing this week.
Next
what you're going to
steps.
come back with next week. Now, I also want to mention that we talked about Lila coming on February 18th. She's going to start the printer. We're going to use that test as a time to actually make something. So Casey and I are thinking that what gets made is and we mean use this of the word poster, that functions as an